Internal Revenue Service IRS tax news. What taxpayers need to know about using the IRS Tax Withholding Estimator. IRS Tax Tip 2021-98, July 8, 2021. All taxpayers should use the IRS Tax Withholding Estimator. There's a link to that Tax Withholding Estimator here to check their withholdings. This tool helps people make sure their employers are taking out the right amount of tax from the employees' paychecks. It can be used by workers as well as retirees, self-employed individuals, and other taxpayers. The money withheld from the employee's paycheck throughout the year should cover the amount of tax they owe. So in other words, the basic idea here being the IRS wants to get paid in the year that you're earning the money, even though you don't really have any clear idea of how much tax you owe given the complexity of the tax system. Meaning, the tax system is a progressive tax system. There's obviously a bunch of deductions that could be involved, and now these credits, and especially the refundable credits, can be quite confusing. And when you have multiple income streams, that makes it even more confusing. So you really don't even know what you're going to owe for taxes until you actually have made the income, until they finalize the tax laws, and then you actually file the tax return. That doesn't happen until the year after. In other words, if you're talking about tax year 2021, you wouldn't actually file the tax return until 2022 by April 15th. But the IRS still wants to get paid during the year. Now, for a lot of times, or for a long time, that was kind of easier to do, because if you have a fairly straightforward type of income, especially if you're in the lower income and you're an employee, then oftentimes you can base the current year on the prior year. So although you have a progressive tax system and it's quite complex, if you have stable income from year to year, then it's still pretty easy to kind of estimate, and your employer, of course, would just take the withholdings from you as you fill out the W-4 in order to give them the information so that they can then take the money out of your paycheck. So that works pretty well, but as time passes, the people's households get a lot more complex. And you might have different revenue streams and whatnot that makes it a little bit more complex. If you're talking about more wealthy individuals, they have always had to do more planning generally, and they're usually going to be using like a CPA or something like that, given the fact that they are going to have different tax streams and whatnot, and they're going to need to be making projections generally to determine how much tax they're going to owe and make sure that they're covering that tax. For lower income individuals, it was often the case where you don't need to do that so much because you can kind of just base it on the prior year and go forward with that. But again, now it's getting kind of complex because the tax law is changing, especially with regards to refundable credits, earned income tax credit, child tax credits, prepayments of certain types of things. People are also changing jobs a lot more, so you're not talking about a one-income household with one person who's working as an employee. Now you're talking about someone who might be working as an employee, multiple people in the household working as employees possibly, and even picking up gig work or something like that. That's a much more confusing picture when you're trying to figure out how much tax you're going to owe if you're all filing on a basically married filing joint kind of tax return type of system. So you need some kind of tool to figure that out, and usually it would take software to figure it out because the tax code's complicated. So this tax withholding estimator is kind of like software now, which would be a projection type of tool. It's taking into consideration more factors than any tool the IRS has basically made for free in the past to kind of project what your income will be in 2021, when your total income will be, and then try to figure out what your taxes will be so that you can then select the proper withholdings. Once you know what your tax is going to be, what you can kind of get your tax at on a yearly basis, which this tool can help you to do, then you have to determine how you're going to pay the IRS. If you're an employee, then you do that by telling your employer how much to withhold with the form W-4. This form will help you to kind of figure out that W-4 withholding. If you're a sole proprietor, then you're going to have to make quarterly payments. And if you're a new sole proprietor, make sure that you're taking this into consideration because people get behind on this. And once you're kind of in the hole, it can be quite depressing with regards to tax debt for people that just didn't really realize how much the tax debt would be because they've never done a sole proprietorship business before, and they always had their employers taking the money out of their paycheck. Okay, So taxpayers can follow these simple steps for using the estimator. Results will include a recommendation of whether the taxpayer should consider submitting a new W-4 Employer's Withholding Allowance Certificate. So that W-4 is what you give your employer for them to know how much to take out of your paycheck. Remember that the employer does not really like, generally, having to take the money out of your paycheck and pay it on your behalf to the government. They're required to do that by law. And they also do not want to give you any tax advice, because if they were to do so, they might possibly get sued. So oftentimes you're going to have to go to the department of your employer for human resources, ask them about the W-4 and how to change your withholdings. They're not going to give you any tax advice, though. They're going to most likely simply say, go fill out the W-4. I'm not allowed to give you any kind of tax advice, because then, I could be liable on whatever on that side. So then you got to use your withholding estimator to figure out how to populate the W-4 so that you can give it back to your employer and they can just input whatever data you give them. So step 1, gather documents. Before beginning, taxpayers should have a copy of their most recent pay stub and tax return. So when you're figuring out your estimation for 2021, you want the 2020 tax return so you can see what happened last year. Last year in 2020 is kind of a funny year. It might be totally different than 2019 and totally different than what you have in 2021, but you still want that base point. And then you want your paycheck stubs for the current year, as well as any other kind of estimates on your income, so that you can plug those into your basically projection tool, which is the tax withholding estimator tool. Taxpayers should go to the main tax withholding estimator page. There's a link to that here on IRS.gov. Once there, they should carefully read all information and click the blue tax withholding estimator button. Step 2, answer the questions. Users will answer a series of questions about their specific tax situation. When they complete each section, they click the blue Next button that takes them to the next section. Step 3, review the results. Taxpayers use the estimator's results to determine if they need to complete a new Form W-4, which they submit to their employer, not to the IRS. So remember, the W-4, not something you give to the IRS. The W-4 you give to the employer so they can properly take out the withholdings that you have told them to take out of your paycheck, and then give that to the IRS so that they can then give you the W-2 at the end of the year that will reflect those withholdings as well as your income. So many employers have an automated system for submitting changes for the Form W-4. Employers should check with their employer to see if this option is available. So the tool helps the user target a tax due amount close to zero or a refund amount. So when you figure out your withholdings, of course, again, you really have no idea what your income will be. And these days, you probably have less of an idea of what your income will be. And because it's a progressive tax, that means you don't really know how much to take out of your wages, because you can't take just a flat tax out of your wages, because as you earn more money, your taxes actually go up, or the rate goes up. So it gets a little bit confusing. You got to kind of do the estimate. This becomes more confusing, and people get quite frustrated when they're a new business and they have no idea what their net income will be on their business, because it's a new business. And again, you got to kind of estimate it, because you got to pay the IRS during the year if you're going to try to avoid penalties and interest and getting behind on the tax payments. So those who receive pension income can use the results from the estimator to complete the Form W-4P and giving it to their payer. So more information can be found at the link below, how to use the IRS Withholding Estimator for Paycheck Checkup. There's a YouTube video for that. You could take a look at that. And there's a link to that here. There'll be a link to this in the description.